Penelope, or The Arithmetic of Hearts, Somerset Maugham's play, rendered as a short story. Prologue. A room ready to believe the best. Penelope O'Farrell's drawing room in John Street didn't announce wealth. It murmured sympathy. The lamp, shaded in a pale, rose-colored silk that made evening kinder, threw an intelligible light on chairs that had been chosen to be sat in, not looked at. There were flowers on the mantel and watercolors that insisted clouds were better as conversation than as climate. Peyton, the parlour-maid, dusted as if she were apologizing to furniture for the indignity. It was a room made for reconciliations and secrets that wanted to become jokes. At 10 minutes to 7, the door opened on the first of the evening's jokes. I, the moustache, and the mirror. Davenport Barlow arrived with the hush of something expensive, short, lacquered, lustrously bald, his little moustache crowded into a curl so disciplined it looked as if it had attended a military academy. He carried the atmosphere of restaurants that have silver cloches and of acquaintances who have coronets. He expected not merely to be received, but to be met. "Is Mrs. O'Farrell not here?" he demanded, astonished that a drawing-room could own both furniture and temerity. "No, sir," Peyton said, arranging her face into its service expression, the one that understood everything without approving of anything. Kindly let her know I've come." "Mrs. O'Farrell is not at home, sir." Barlow blinked. He did not like a sentence in which Barlow and not at home appeared together. "Not at home, but—" Mrs. O'Farrell said, "Would you kindly sit down and make yourself comfortable? And may I give you the Morning Post?" Barlow accepted the paper because one does not quarrel with the press in a drawing-room, allowed a tiny whiskey and soda to be poured by Fate's domestic hand, and advanced to the mirror above the mantel to brush his moustache into good behavior. The Morning Post opened under his thumbs like a cathedral service. He read the titled comings and goings with the serene gratitude of a man checking on his investments. "The Duchess of St. Erth returned to Wales yesterday. The Marchioness of Merriston has arrived in Grosvenor Square. The Marchioness of Surlow and Lady Eleanor King leave for Paris this morning." The world was in its usual place, and Davenport Barlow was in the middle of it. Second, a sainted mother in an omnibus. Appropriate heavy breathing preceded Penelope's mother. Mrs. Golightly always looked as if she had just run up from somewhere worthy. A meeting room with bad acoustic at the Albert Hall, perhaps, where the Central African Mission produced pamphlets by the bale and converts by the anecdote. She arrived in bursts of good nature, wrapped in a shawl of opinions. "Are you here, Davenport? Where's Penelope?" "She's out," Barlow returned, deeply affronted by the word, as if out were an indecency. Peyton slid in, with the Church Times and the smooth deployment of a tea tray. Mrs. Golightly's face did an expressive little throb when she saw the newspaper. "The Church Times, Peyton?" "Mrs. O'Farrell," said Ma'am. Peyton was not in the business of motives. "Odd," Mrs. Golightly muttered. "I usually encounter it only when I've done something I need forgiveness for." It did not occur to Barlow to sit unless a woman told him to. It never occurred to Mrs. Golightly to sit unless a chair insisted. She landed, effused, and fanned herself with the Church Times, which took it piously. The third professor who would not become a type. Professor Golightly came next. He always looked like a gentleman who had wandered into mathematics for the sake of the company and then stayed for the clarity. Tall, spare, grey hair, well-behaved, suit unrumpled, he would have made a sound physician or an alarming solicitor. "Hello, Davenport," he nodded, and to his wife, "My dear, I thought you were converting infidels at the Albert Hall." "Tomorrow," she said. "This evening, we are dealing with family." Peyton reappeared with last week's Athenium and a glass of barley water for the professor, who took both as if they were an exam from which he expected to learn something. Last week's? Admirable. It gives one a small head start. What does Penelope want with barley water and the Athenium? Mrs. Golightly wondered aloud. To keep our hands occupied while our minds are taken, her husband replied. The solicitor with the benign pocket. Mr. Beadsworth, the family solicitor, moved as if doors were a courtesy extended to him personally. He wore benevolence like a well-cut coat. Peyton offered him the Law Times and a glass of port, with a solemnity that implied he ought to take it even if it killed him. "I've had a telegram," he said by way of greeting. "So have I," Mrs. Golightly declared, with the energy of a person possessed of news she disapproves. "And I," Barlow added triumphantly. "Mine mentions the Archduchess Anastasia." "Mine mentions the Central African Mission," Mrs. Golightly countered. "Mine mentions 6 and 8pence, said Beadsworth, the only man in London likely to attend a summons that contained a small fee as an appetite. "Mine," Professor Golightly observed, "says decimal 7035. He turned the numbers in his mouth and found nothing to them but arithmetic. Though now I look at it, I believe that's our telephone. They compared telegrams like prophecies and got no nearer to sense. It was at this point that the author of the puzzle solved it by entering the room. The girl who could laugh at lightning. Penelope came in as people come out of a dream they wish to resume. Softly, smilingly, aware. Kissing her mother, she submitted her cheek to Barlow, with the patience of a deity enduring incense, received Beadsworth's hand like an old coin returned to circulation, and offered her father her forehead as if he were the owner of a seal. She asked Barlow if the whiskey suited him, and the professor why the barley water remained full, and took in at a glance the entire domestic theatre, my mother's anxiety, my father's amusement, my uncle's dignity, Mr. Beadsworth's mild bewilderment. She saw it all, and she kept her smile. "Now, my dear," Mrs. Golightly implored, "will you explain those telegrams?" "Yes," Penelope said. "I wanted you all to come this afternoon, and I find it's useful to bait the trap with the right morsel. For Uncle Davenport, it was an archduchess, for Mother a mission, for Mr. Beadsworth a fee, and for Father, numbers." "Decimal 7035, the professor repeated. "Gerard 7035, with the decimals shifted. Ingenious." "Child," Mrs. Golightly cried, "then there is no Archduchess Anastasia." "If there is," Penelope said gravely, "I am her spiritual sponsor." Barlow colored as if someone had criticized a duchess in front of him. "Penelope, you cannot trifle with names of that rank." "My dear uncle, I trifled with rank. I did not know it had a name." Beadsworth chuckled. Mrs. Golightly looked equal parts scandalized and delighted, and Professor Golightly, who could do two things at once, when those things were thinking and loving his daughter, gave her an approving nod that made her brave enough to speak the truth. "I have asked you here because I intend to divorce Dickie. There are silences that fall like plates, and silences that fall like feathers. This one fell like a choir stopping. It made room for astonishment. "My dear child," said her mother. "Good gracious," said Barlow, delighted into horror. "Penelope," murmured Professor Golightly, in the tone he reserved for truths that required moral calculus. Mr. Beadsworth considered the floorboards for a moment as if they might offer case law. That is a statement with consequences. Might we have reasons? Reasons, she laughed, caught herself, and put her hands together as if to keep them from shaking. Because my husband has spent the last month inventing an enormous old lady named Mrs. Mac, who has one of those illnesses to which the only known remedy is a rubber of bridge at the club. Because the old lady has had more operations than respectability allows. Because when Dickie says consultation, it is Ada Fergusson. And because I have had to sit here being clever about it, so I shouldn't cry. Ada Fergusson, Barlow repeated, relieved to have a name he might file. Is she anything? Frequently, Penelope said. Penelope, Mrs. Golightly admonished, shocked into a smile. Professor Golightly, who hated the word always except in proofs, folded his arms. May I begin? He asked mildly. You may say anything you like, Penelope answered, with the confidence of someone who already knows a little of it. He reached for the writing paper on the round table, took up a pencil, and with a small smile, wrote in a hand that had never trembled over an equation. 2 + 2 = 5. Penelope stared. Father, a dreadful calamity has occurred. You've gone mad. Not yet, he said. I am merely illustrating the difficulty of making the world yield the results we desire by insisting in a loud voice on the wrong sum. Observe, if I write 2 and 2 are 5, 500 times, I may convince myself of the statement. It will remain false. There is an entire science of this error. It is called human nature. Mrs. Golightly, who liked sermons if they took her side, frowned. Do you mean to take Dickie's side against your child? I am taking the side of reality, he answered, which is the only ally our child will have when her anger has gone to bed. He put the pencil down and looked directly at Penelope. My dear, you have fed the man on strawberry ice for 5 years, at breakfast, at luncheon, at tea. You have kissed him when he went out, and kissed him when he came in, and kissed him when he read the paper, so that the Times stuck to his ear. You have been so good to him that he had no opportunity to be good to you, and men, like dogs and proofs, enjoy the satisfaction of being right. The soul sickens of continuous sweetness. It goes outside and buys a sausage roll. Penelope's mouth curved against her will. Your metaphors are very odd, she said, and very practical. Practicality is merely mathematics with its tie off, he replied. If you want him back, give him back his head. Ask him nothing, require nothing, be lovely, be late. Above all, offer Ada Fergusson every occasion to be exacting, jealous, hungry, tedious. She will take them. And the minute the pressure is removed, the spring will point home. Barlow drew himself up. This conversation is improper. Uncle, Penelope said sweetly, everything is improper until it works. Beadsworth, who had watched husbands go out and come back for 20 years, nodded once, as a man does when a sum balances and he needn't add aloud. In the meantime, he added gently, if you should still wish to do anything legal, I am downstairs in chambers most days. Penelope kissed his cheek. If I need 6 and 8pence of comfort, I will know where to go. Mrs. Golightly was fairly panting with disapproval and sympathy. Penelope, are you sure you know what you're doing? No, Penelope said, but I know what I am not doing. I am not going to feed him strawberry ice until we both die of it. It was then that the front door opened and Dickie's whistle, brisk, cheerful, apology-proof, came down the passage like a good mood with cufflinks. Penelope breathed, looked quickly at her father, and in that second became the heroine of her own comedy. Sixth, The Innocent Lies of Dr. O'Farrell. Richard O'Farrell, Dickie, was 35 and looked precisely 10 years younger when he felt successful and 10 years older when he felt looked at. He operated on good humor as a principle and good looks as an accident. His hair would forgive him anything. His manner would persuade strangers to hand him secrets and coins. He came in laughing. "Hello, I say, what's become of you, Pen? You always come down and help me off with my coat. Is it because your sainted mother is here?" "That," Penelope said, "and other curiosities of Providence." He kissed Mrs. Golightly on the cheek, shook hands with the professor, nodded at Beadsworth, and catching sight of Barlow's small fortress of self-importance, saluted him with irreverence. "What price duchesses today, uncle?" he grinned. "I beg your pardon," Barlow replied, as if the price of duchesses were not something one discussed with medical men. Dickie, who whistled better than he lied, failed at once. "I've had a day of it. An interesting case. Consultation after consultation. I had to go to the club afterwards to unconsult a bit." Penelope smiled, because it is cruel to laugh. "What is your patient's name?" "Mrs. Mac." He stopped. "Nothing of importance." "Mrs. Mac nothing," Barlow repeated. "I don't believe I know the family." "Oh, for heaven's sake," Dickie said irritably. "Mac. Mrs. Mac. Grey hair?" Penelope inquired with affectionate interest. "Corkscrew curls? Pretty blue eyes?" Dickie blinked, then decided that a lie once invented deserved art. "Exactly." "Catherine," said Ada Fergusson from the doorway. If it had been a theatre, someone would have coughed. Ada came in handsome, assured, thoroughly satisfied with her own reflection, and endowed with the sense, never absent in the successful flirt, that rooms are backdrops until she occupies them. She shook Penelope's hand with effusion, dabbed a friendly look on Mrs. Golightly, and turned toward Dickie with the intimate cordiality of a lady patronizing a shop where she is allowed to stand behind the counter. "We haven't met for ages," she observed. "You passed me in Piccadilly the other day and cut me dead." "I'm so short-sighted," said Dickie. "Don't be absurd," Penelope told him amiably. "You can spot a guinea 50 yards away." She turned to Ada. "I cannot thank you enough for recommending Mrs. Mac to my husband. She takes a lot of looking after." Ada, who possessed the rare instinct that tells a woman instantly which of two smiles is genuine, decided, to her future sorrow, that Penelope's simplicity could be trusted. "Poor dear," she said sweetly. "I like to do what I can." "Look," Penelope added with artless fervor, "we have 2 stalls for the music hall tonight, and I have a headache that has crept up my skull and gone to roost. Will you replace me?" Ada glanced, to register his consent, at Dickie. He looked not at her, but at his wife. "Are you sure, Pen?" "Quite," she said. "Dinner first, somewhere noisy, then nonsense. You'll be good for one another." Dickie, faithful to his training and cowardice, mixed a dose. Penelope, faithful to her plan, swallowed it. Ada, faithful to her nature, made certain the cushions were arranged comfortably and her hair would survive the evening. The drawing-room arranged its expression. Polite indifference. Peyton held the door, and Penelope lay back, while the people she loved best and least went out to enjoy themselves. When the front door shut, she sat up and, like a sensible woman left alone with a room that suspected tears, cried very quietly into the prettiest cushion. The business of medicine. Dickie found medicine easier when people were ill. His consulting room smelled faintly of carbolic and heavily of reassurance. There were photographs of babies whose mothers had named them after physicians and engravings of houses in Harley Street whose rent was as instructive as the view. He examined a very timid man and prescribed something that would do no harm if swallowed in modest quantities. The man placed 2 guineas on the mantelpiece as if the coins were radioactive, and Dickie, with kindness that sounded ill-tempered, snapped, "Not there, man. On the desk. There are limits." Then came Mrs. Watson, a little widow in reliable black, who took off her gloves with an air of making her hands available for public use. She was what physicians call difficult, not because she was unkind, but because she was indefatigably interested. She had been examined by every important doctor in London. She washed in the Lancet and dried herself on the British Medical Journal. She brought to Dickie not symptoms so much as a reading list. His heart sank when, in the middle of his best manner, she revealed herself as a doctor's widow and placed around his neck a red woolen comforter she had knitted herself, and thereafter returned twice on the pretext of toast and jam. He thought, as he bowed her out, "Sati." Yes, that's the word I wanted. Sati. He shouted it to Penelope when she came down and waved the comforter as a flag of distress. "Pen, doctors' widows ought to practice sati." "Darling," she said gravely, "I'm sure it contravenes a statute, and I refuse to throw myself on your pyre until you've repented." He grinned, a boy under a hat. "I say, you've changed lately." "How?" "You don't come down when I go out. You don't sit on the arm of my chair when I smoke. You don't ask what time I'll be back." She met his eyes, and for a moment her heart did something unwise. "Oh," she said lightly, "then you have room for your elbows." Peyton, announced Ada Fergusson, with the coolness of a woman who has refused to be surprised professionally for 15 years. Ada sailed in, and Penelope, with scrupulous kindness, sailed out. Ada had come professionally. She sat like a patient and used her voice like a friend. It was a clever move, under Penelope's very nose, with a fee to decorate the transaction. She also wanted a cheque for £180 for differences, and she got it. And when the impressive fee of 2 sovereigns and a 2-shilling piece had been positioned on the desk, Penelope came back and, like a wife, returned it to Ada's purse. It would have been petty to observe that they were Dickie's last 2 sovereigns of the week. When Ada had gone, Dickie rang his broker to ask about the Johannesburg and New Jerusalem. The broker pronounced the shares unclean in a tone that implied immortality would result from not touching them. Dickie put down the receiver and thought savage thoughts against an Old Testament that contained no standard of care for minds. Davenport Barlow drifted in, to be flirtatiously unwell, and confessed, with the air of a man admitting to devoutness, that he had made an impression on a very dashing married woman. "Not strictly proper," he admitted, "but it appears to be unavoidable." "On the contrary," Dickie said, surprising himself with his own wisdom, "it is the most avoidable thing in London. It only requires a man to want to avoid it, and that, of course, is the difficulty." Barlow changed the subject to his liver. Dickie told him to give up every pleasant food he had ever met and to run around the park in a sweater before breakfast. Barlow, who had believed that doctors prescribed with discrimination where friends dined, looked insulted by fate. When Barlow had gone, Penelope asked if Dickie had packed. He said no, and they smiled a little at one another with their mutual history between them like weather. The 8th, the arithmetic of outrage. It is possible to be wrong with decency and right without any. Dickie contrived both at once. when Penelope told him she had known all along about Ada, about Mrs. Mack, about racing masquerading as illness. Dickie was outraged. Not that he had done wrong, but that she had not made a fuss about it. "You should have divorced me," he shouted, "or at least have thrown something." "My dear," she replied, in a voice that went around the room and smiled at the furniture, "I prefer to buy hats." He formally announced that since she was indecently tolerant, he would be honorable. He would separate. He would not live in a house where sin was taken for granted. "Darling," she said, "do not separate on my account. We've friends for that." It was at this precise moment that Professor and Mrs. Golightly came up, answered his moral fervour with the world's gentlest comic heresies. "Man is naturally polygamous," Mrs. Golightly observed, her face pink with the adventure, and departed before bewilderment turned into penitence. And then came the hats. Girls from Françoise's bearing boxes like victories, Penelope trying them on like arguments, Dickie telling the telephone that Mrs. Mack had had a relapse and would not go to Paris by night or by day. Ada rang that evening in the voice of a naval surgeon, asking for Dr. O'Farrell. Penelope replied in the manner of fate. "I believe he has been at Mrs. Mack's all the evening," she said, and stood, afterwards, staring at the receiver with a smile that made Peyton leave the room quietly and shut the door as if she had caught a child not crying. 9. How to be 6 women. Penelope's boudoir had captured a bit of autumn and pinned it to the walls, leaves in a jar, that particular sunlight that makes dust motes look theatrical. Photographs of Dickie kept the room honest. She dressed that morning as a person puts on courage, layer by layer, with a look in the glass that asked unreasonable questions and promised to behave anyway. Her parents came for a last dividend of drama before luncheon. "Dickie adores me," she told them, and laughed at herself because she heard the triumphant child in her voice. "Has he told you so?" her father asked. He never rated the spoken sum too high. "We are not on speaking terms," she replied. "We are using gestures." Professor Golightly, who never wasted an opportunity to be scandalous in order to be sensible, offered the advice that becomes mothers anxious and daughters dangerous. "Be 6 women, my dear. If he cannot chase, he will not love. Even a barn-door hen makes her lawful mate work for the privilege of being superior." Mrs. Golightly, who had remained married for 20 years by means she did not like to explain, threw up her hands. "I shall be thankful when you return to mathematics, Charles. That hussy X has done you no good." "I have kissed the pelican," the professor said gravely. "He may peck." Peyton announced Dickie, and the Golightleys made a swift, invisible cloud of themselves and were gone. Penelope rang for Peyton. "Pack the little flat portmanteau, will you? And put in the green charmeuse. Call a cab in half an hour." Dickie stood very still at the door and put the hurt into his eyes that had formerly been in her heart. "Are you going away?" "Oh, yes," she said, opening a magazine. "I thought you knew." "I gave up Paris not to annoy you." "Not at all," she answered, smiling up at him. "It wouldn't have annoyed me the least bit." He came and sat beside her and took her hands. She let him, because one must let a boy hold the reins a moment before one turns the horse. He tried truth. Mrs. Mack is dead. Then honesty. Mrs. Mack never existed. Then penitence. I will never do it again. And at last, a small, shabby tyranny. He locked the door. She looked at the key in his pocket as a locksmith looks at a puzzle box. "Are you going to feed me bread and water?" she asked mildly. He unlocked the door and put the key on the table. It is difficult to be a jailer when one's soul wishes to be forgiven. "Would you rather I stayed?" she asked. No, he said miserably. He meant yes. He meant I do not know what I mean, except that I do not want to be unhappy alone. Then go and see whether Peyton has taken the bag down, she told him. And when he returned, she said, ring and ask her to bring it up again. He knelt and kissed her hands with extravagance and relief, and she let him and reminded herself, inwardly, that strawberry ice, when rationed, is not a bad thing. She told him she would pop round to the Hendersons to beg off the motor trip. He asked at what time she would return. She blew him a kiss over her shoulder and went out, certain of nothing except that she must not say soon. X. The death of a lady who never lived. If one invents a person, one owes her a respectable end. Penelope, who had given Mrs. Mac a lifetime's worth of operations in a month, decided that the lady should die beautifully and be grateful. When Ada called that afternoon to inquire professionally, Penelope, with grave kindness, told her the news. Dead, Ada repeated, and the word fell out of her mouth like a porcelain cup. She died this morning, Penelope said, in Dickie's arms, with a smile. She mentioned Mr. Walker, her husband, who has been dead 40 years. It is one of the benefits of invention that facts can be made. Penelope offered sherry. Ada refused and then accepted, because sherry formalizes sorrow and gives the face something to do. Dickie came in and stopped, as a man will who has stepped into a play he hasn't rehearsed. What's this? I have broken the news to Ada, Penelope said, with a look that did not forgive him for Mrs. Mac, because there was nothing to forgive, but did forgive him everything else. Ada dabbed her eyes and tried a small request to fate. Were you there at the end? In a sense, Dickie answered, who had never known the lady when she was beginning. Penelope slipped out to fetch more sherry and left them alone. Ada threw off the last shreds of mourning and showed her temper. What does this mean? It means we have done with subterfuge, he said. I am in love with my wife. She laughed, the clean laugh of a cat that has seen through a bag. My poor dear soul, did you think I was in love with you? Dickie stood there, a gentleman who had left his pride on a chair and could not remember which chair it was, and bore it. She threatened letters. He said calmly that Penelope knew everything. Ada went white and then vivid, and at that precise, merciful moment, Davenport Barlow presented himself as a solution wrapped in an extravagantly polite waistcoat. Ada announced she was returning to her husband in Malta by way of Paris. Barlow announced he was going to Paris by way of chivalry. They smiled at one another with exactly the same number of teeth. Penelope warned her uncle against pranks. He answered that 52 ensured platonic arrangements, which Penelope privately doubted and forgave. Ada kissed Penelope, asked Dickie to keep her informed of any reliable tips on the stock exchange, pressed Barlow's arm with the authority of a woman who has found a porter for her luggage and a title for her address book, and was gone. Oof, said Dickie, which was French for 1,000 things at once. Don't do that again, Penelope told him. It is a foreign language and may give you ideas. I will only do the one thing again, he replied devoutly. I will love you. You may, she allowed, sparingly. You are a little beast, he said, and kissed her. I promised to allow it, she reminded him, checking her wristwatch like a woman pricing a hat. Not to encourage it. He drew back, aggrieved and grateful. Then sit there, if you please, while I look at you. There. Now you may go to the Hendersons. She went. He let her because he had learned that not letting her would make her go in earnest. 11th, the arithmetic balances. Lest it be supposed that marriages end with declarations, let it be said they rarely begin with them either. Penelope came back. Dickie had not moved far. They had tea together and did not tell Peyton not to admit anyone. She did not admit anyone anyway, because Peyton had taken a maternal dislike to interruptions. A week passed that did not appear on any calendar, one of those weeks in which two people begin again and pretend they have not done so, out of respect for the version of themselves who got them this far. Dickie stumbled and recovered, confessed where confession helped, and held his tongue where display would only burnish vanity. Penelope rationed sweetness. She did not meet him at the door every evening. She did not sit on his chair every morning. She did not ask at what exact moment he would return. And when he asked her, occasionally, she smiled because she heard in his voice the echo of Ada's fatal question and felt in her own the warmth of being wanted and not managed. Professor Golightly, who liked to test theorems after proving them, wrote 2 + 2 = 4 on a paper in large figures and threw it away without showing it to anyone. He did not need to. Mrs. Golightly fasted one day in Lent with a zeal that astonished her and rectified nothing. Beadsworth walked home whistling as he tried to calculate whether a debt never paid but always acknowledged yields interest in affection. He concluded that it does and did not tell anyone because solicitors are shy of sentiment. Davenport Barlow went to Paris and came back with an anecdote that had the outline of scandal and the content of luncheon. As for Ada Fergusson, she posted no letters. Womanly women rarely do. When they are done, they are done. One evening near the end of the month, fog came up from the river to see what London was making of itself, and stopped in John Street to examine Penelope's lamp. The O'Farrells ate a small supper. The conversation was untidy and affectionate. Somewhere in it, Penelope leaned to straighten a plate, and Dickie kissed the knuckle nearest him without comment, which is a domestic sacrament older than law. "Pen," he said later, as she took up her cloak, "at what time will you be back?" She opened the door a crack, gave him a look that has belonged to wives since Troy, and made no answer whatsoever. He stood there and smiled into the empty doorway. Peyton, passing like a well-trained ghost with the tea things, permitted herself, the privacy of a mind no one had ever thought to imagine, to be very pleased. There it is, she thought. They've found the hour between asking and telling. 12th interludes and asides, being materials for a fuller account. Because life does not keep to scenes, there were among these chapters several moments the reader might wish to know. Ada's cab. After her first triumphant visit to the consulting room, Ada sat in a cab and observed herself in the small oval mirror. She had expected to feel clever. She felt, disconcertingly, seen through. "Catherine Mack," she murmured, turning the name like a jewel that is either paste or fortune. She decided that Catherine was too sentimental, but that Mack had money to it. She powdered her nose and laughed, and told herself, because a woman must sometimes be both client and expert, that Penelope was naive. She wanted Penelope to be naive. She required it of her day's work. She went to dinner, determined to find Dickie delightful. He was. She found him less delightful, however, each time he left 5 minutes later than he wished. Peyton's opinions. Peyton dusting the photographs of Dr. O'Farrell that faced various angles of the room with a frankness best left to brides, had opinions that no one had asked. They were simple, reliable, and precise. That Mrs. O'Farrell had a smile like a forgiving bell. that Dr. O'Farrell would be improved by hunger occasionally, that Francoise sent hats that cost more than Peyton's father had earned in a year working honest iron, that Mrs. Fergusson powdered too obligingly, and that Mr. Davenport Barlow's moustache consumed more attention than could be spared for anything human. She did not despise any of them. She merely dusted, remembered to have hot water just before it was requested, and disapproved of the stock exchange. Dr. Rogers, pompous and proper. When Mrs. Watson had asked for a recommendation, Dickie had sent her, out of mingled mischief and justice, to Dr. Rogers, who kept a consulting room at the other end of the street and the other end of Manor. That very afternoon, Rogers passed Dickie on the pavement, lifting his hat with a mechanical politeness that suggested his hat had been trained better than his smile. "Afternoon," he said, and looked past Dickie's shoulder at Penelope's window in the way of a man who is never late for jealousy. "Weather holds," he added in a tone that blamed someone. Dickie agreed and went in and promptly forgot the man's existence, which was his best revenge. The Professor's Notebook, on the barn door hen. Professor Golightly kept a notebook for teaching, the first page of which was always clean, and the second always scandalous. On the night after his advice to Penelope, he wrote, "The barn door hen, pursued, is a moralist. Pursued not at all. She is a statue. A husband who cannot hunt is a parishioner. A husband who is never found is a bad investment. Therefore, be the field and the fence and the hedge, and sometimes be the gate." QED. His wife found the notebook, read this page, and shook with snorting laughter, then wished she hadn't, then laughed again. Ada in the park with Davenport. A week before Paris, Barlow met Ada in the park. He greeted her with a hat that knew what it was about. She discovered, as she had suspected, that he spoke of duchesses by their Christian names. She offered Malta with Paris on the way, and he offered Paris with Malta in the story. They smiled and understood the arrangement perfectly. She was to be looked after. He was to be useful. He went home afterwards and stood in front of his mirror and brushed his moustache until it gleamed like a dangerous conviction. 13. The last small scene. We return, after these interludes, to John Street. It is late. The lamp is a pink moon. The window shows nothing but its own reflection and the possibility of fog. Penelope opens the front door with her own key and steps into the hall. Peyton is a shadow who has fallen asleep, standing up, and wakes without moving. "Good evening, ma'am," Peyton says, as one might say, "welcome back to your life." Penelope slips into her boudoir, takes off her hat, looks in the glass, and makes a little face at herself. She is a woman who has done something difficult and is very slightly ashamed to have done it well. Dickie has not gone to bed. He is in the drawing room, behaving in the modern manner, pretending to read because he is too honest to pretend to sleep. He hears the faint click of her door, the minor rustle of a dress that has never made an ungraceful sound, and the small silence that means she is smiling at nothing. He goes to her door and knocks with his knuckles, as gently as he kissed them the other night. There is no answer. He opens the door very quietly, steps in, and looks at the woman who chose him 5 years and 3 months and 2 days ago, and chooses him again now without writing it down. He touches her hand with his lips, because some sums need not be done aloud. In the morning, over breakfast, Penelope sits on a chair of her own. Dickie opens the Times and does not get to the leading article. "Pen," he says, "at what time will you be back?" She looks at him, and the corner of her mouth performs a calculation no one taught her. 4, she says, or 5. 4 or 5, he repeats, as if it were a rhyme. I will be here. He is. She is a little late. 2 and 2 are 4. Epilogue. What they learned without saying so. It does not matter how often Professor Golightly writes 2 plus 2 equals 4. The world remains ornery and sometimes mistaken. But in John Street, 2 people who had been clever learned something better than cleverness. That certainty spoils faster than cream, that apologies are specimens and must not be displayed too often, or they rot. That mystery, in the domestic sphere, is simply the refusal to answer questions that will be answered in practice. That change of air is good for everyone, even when it consists only of opening a window no one believed in. Mrs. Golightly returned to her missions with a new theology, that one must sometimes convert the near heathen before the far. Beadsworth put the 6 and 8pence in a ledger page, where the totals stayed delightfully wrong forever. Barlow told no one anything that had actually happened in Paris. Ada wrote from Malta a note with a new tone, practical, cheerful, almost human, asking Dickie whether he had heard of any reliable South African mines. He sent back Johannesburg and New Jerusalem, avoid, and she took the advice. Peyton bought a new cap with ribbon out of money she could not account for. When asked by the other maid what color it was, Peyton said, 4. The maid looked at her queerly and said nothing to anyone, because a secret makes even a maid feel like a duchess. And Penelope, who had started to divorce her husband and ended by remarrying him without a registry or a luncheon, practiced a new arithmetic every day. She counted to 1 sometimes, when she wanted to fling her arms around his neck and be finished with discipline, and to 10 when she wanted to be clever again, and to 4 most mornings when she remembered strawberry ice and chose conscientiously toast buttered on the toasted side. When she forgot and sat on the arm of his chair to read the paper with him, Dickie didn't say a word about strawberry ice. He folded the paper in half for her, took her free hand with his unoccupied one, and kissed, with barefaced impunity, the knuckle that had once taught him midnight manners. 2 and 2 were 4. They knew it without writing it. They remembered it without saying so. And when he asked, occasionally, "At what time will you be back?" Penelope would answer with numbers that didn't matter and then come home earlier than either of them had guessed, because love, in the end, is not a problem to be solved, but a habit to be kept. End.